Hi everyone, it's Erev Tisha B'Av, the day before the 9th of Av, the traditional day in which Jews mourn the destruction of the second and first temples and other calamities that have happened throughout Jewish history. And today's video is titled, Is God Bad? I say this title and I say this video with much trepidation. I would like to look at the different sources today and discuss this topic, Is God Bad? So, I'm bringing this up for two reasons. Today, I got the bad news that my friend's son passed away of a horrible cancer called DIPG. And this lecture is for the Elui Nishmas of Chaim David Yosef ben Shlomo Eliyahu, who is being buried today, probably buried by now. A very sad and very tragic case of a young, innocent, and pure child who I knew myself. And I also want to say this here because I have a client who I've been working with for years who, due to his extreme suffering, says that he believes God is evil and he wished that God never created him. I don't think these questions are unique to these situations. And today, for my Tisha B'Av video, I'm going to discuss these deep questions. Now, these questions are things people have been asking for thousands of years, and every religious and philosophical system and every person who suffered, which is everyone, has been asking these questions. But I would like to explore a few different approaches within the Jewish tradition. Is God bad? To further the question, I would like to speak about the current situation that we're going through right now, where the whole world is gripped in a situation, which I'm not going to mention, because of YouTube's restrictions on speaking about this stuff. But I want to explore that a little bit in a roundabout way as well. So the basic Western understanding, philosophical understanding, which I think most people would agree with, at least in the Jewish tradition, and probably others as well, is that God has three known attributes: omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. All-powerful, all-present, and all-knowing. But I think most people, at least in the Western traditions, starting from Judaism, would also add that God is all good. So despite the fact that we do see bad, we see evil in the world, and we know that everything comes from God, yet we hold strongly that God is all good. When we look at the Torah itself, though, it's very obvious that God's involved in the world, and God is called vengeful. God shows anger, and for difficult things that happen, such as the destructions of the temples, that's later in the Torah, as well as all the different sins that the Jewish people do in the desert and other times, we see that God is directly involved and brings punishment upon people. But I'm not sure that people would call punishment bad. I think that punishment could be called necessary. But what about, again, children who are sick? What about the Holocaust? What about individual suffering of innocent people? Why do good people suffer? That's the age-old question. To add further to this question, we have this period now called the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av tonight, where it is known you're not supposed to do dangerous things, and it's a dangerous time. Many calamities, which I don't need to list here, have happened throughout Jewish history, besides the destruction of the temples. Even current events have happened. And we see we're all very nervous and careful when this time period comes. Another friend of mine, child, drowned, but thank God she was pulled out and looks like she's going to be okay. And that was just a few weeks ago. So it's a very, very scary time. And why does God set aside a time that should be scary, that should be difficult? It doesn't seem good. I understand that there's bad things in the world or punishment, but why would God set aside a time for such things? In the Western tradition, as we said, we believe God is all good. But again, when we look in the Torah, we see these verses that God is judgmental, does vengeance, does wrath on people. That's found throughout the Torah. And yet we also find two verses which explicitly say that God creates evil. What are we going to do with these verses? The first one is Isaiah. Yotzer or uvrei choshak, ose shalom uvrei ra, ani Adonai ose kol elah. He creates light and creates darkness. He makes peace and he creates evil. I am the Lord, I make all of these. Even more so, we see in the verse in Eicha, Lamentations, which we read tonight in Tisha B'Av, in the third and very beautiful chapter of Lamentations. In the verse it says this, verse 38, Mipi elyon lo sitze haraos avatov, From the mouth, is it not true that both evil and good emanate? So how do we understand these verses? Not only in the Torah do we see God as wrathful, and we also look around the world and we see people suffering and the Nazis committing murder and all sorts of innocent people being hurt and people being sick, all sorts of tragedies, disasters. And then we even see these verses in Yirmiyahu and Isaiah, which says explicitly that God creates evil. So how could it be that we have this tradition that God is good? This is a deep question, and something, again, for thousands of years people have been exploring. But I want to give two main approaches. I'm going to simplify it down to these two main approaches. Each one has its benefits, and each one has its detriments in their approach. The first is Rambam Maimonides, and he speaks a lot about evil in the third section of the Guide to the Perplexed. There he speaks about the problem of evil and his philosophy around it. I think you could also say some of Ramban's commentary to the Torah as well coincides with the Rambam. Rambam basically has what we call a deistic approach. It's actually based quite a bit on what the Greek philosophers believed that God was. Now, people think of Greek legends and myths and all the different pagan gods, etc. But what a lot of people don't know, unless you study philosophy or philosophy through the auspices of the Rambam, the Maimonides, and the Guide to the Perplexed, is that Aristotle and other Greek philosophers actually did believe in God. But they believed in this concept, which we call in Hebrew hakdamos, that God left the world behind, and that God's running the world through intermediary spheres, through physics, so to speak, or some other sort of astrological system, and that the world goes according to its way. Now, lest you think these Greeks were just, totally wrong and off, Maimonides himself defends the Greek philosophy and says that the reason they thought this way was because of our problem, the problem of why does the good suffer and the evil prosper? The same questions that we find talked about in Koheles, Ecclesiastes, and that we all wonder. So their conclusion was there must be a creator, the Greeks felt, the Greek philosophers anyway, but because there's evil in the world and doesn't coincide with our view of what good and evil should be, it must be that God left the world behind and is running it according to physics or spheres or something like that. However, Rambam's opinion is not strictly according to the Greek opinion, obviously. The Torah itself speaks of God's providence. So Rambam does believe in God's providence. God's involved in the world at select times for select things. So he would say that all the events in the Torah which God's involved in the world, those individual instances of hashgacha, of divine providence, they happen because that was what God wanted to bring out amongst the people. And that was their connection. Ramban says that the tzaddikim, that when people are righteous, those people will have God's providence. But otherwise, so to speak, like Aristotelians, we're sort of left to the auspices of how the world works. And therefore, bad stuff can happen in the world. And it's not necessarily the cause of God. God lets the world go according to its ways. But the reason why the Rambam and the Ramban and other medieval commentators are not like the philosophers is they do believe that God can and will intervene, as we do see in the Torah. And that's how they understand it. This approach is what you call deistic, that God is sort of above and beyond and not necessarily completely found in this world. It was interesting, I was watching an old video of Dr. Jordan Peterson, and you can find the video yourself on YouTube if you look up Dr. Jordan Peterson, Tragedy versus Evil. And he actually, I believe in that video, it's an older video of his way before his current fame. And I believe there he actually says, I heard this idea through Jewish sources. But the idea here, again, according to this idea that God is sort of removed from the world and only involves himself in the world at select times, which is a Jewish approach to the Greek approach. He there distinguishes between the difference between evil and tragedy. God is not evil, according to this approach. God does not do evil. God only does good, but he lets the world run according to the way it is. So if a sick person dies, that's because it's a tragedy. The world runs a certain way. We're built in a way that we should die, and there should be disease. Also, Maimonides adds there in the third part of the Guide to the Perplexed that people themselves are often the cause of their misfortunes, that oftentimes not taking care of themselves physically or doing certain actions. God is not necessarily going to intervene when a person does bad things, again, unless they are meritorious to have God do so. So too, the current situation that's going on in the world, you can also say, isn't evil. God's not doing evil According to this approach, the deistic approach, God is just allowing the world to go according to its normal way. We're not meritorious for God to step in. That doesn't mean that God doesn't step in individual cases. We hear about 9/11, for instance, and we hear about individual miracle cases where people were saved. So too here, there are stories like that in this situation. But generally, the world goes according to its way. I read in the art scroll on Daniel, they asked a question there, why doesn't God intervene all the time? And they answer there that God set up the world in a way that man must have free will. It is so important for us humans to have free will and act in the world. God cannot step in and intervene all the time to change reality. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point? So again, we're distinguishing between tragedy and evil. Evil is malicious. The Nazis did what they did because what they did was evil. That was human choice to be evil. Tragedy is the way the world works, and God may not necessarily step in to fix a situation. Now, there are many sources in the Talmud which have all sorts of other crazy situations, so I'm just bringing it down to these two basic situations here, between this approach and the next approach, which I'm going to bring. But I want to admit that there are many other sources, both in the Torah and the Talmud, which speak of all sorts of different situations regarding tragedy, evil, etc. I'm just really bringing it down to, again, two approaches. So again, according to this approach, Rambam, maybe Ramban, this deistic approach where God is sort of removed from the world, it's easy to see why bad things happen sometimes. And even when people do evil to each other, God might not jump in because of the issue of free will. Maybe God will jump in if a person is especially meritorious or for some other reason, maybe to save somebody else. Maybe an evil person could be saved by God specifically with providence, but that's only because they may have some other reason to bring that forth. So the other approach, the major approach, which I'm going to deal with today, is the approach of the Baal Shem Tov, the Hasidic approach, which is God's providence on everything. And I think this is actually the folk approach. I believe this has really been the approach that people have always had. It seems to be the approach the Torah itself has, that God is involved in every single aspect and detail of creation, and that every single detail is from God. That is the Baal Shem Tov's approach. He says there in the famous story that a leaf doesn't fall from a tree unless God ordains it. There's a story there where a leaf falls from a tree and it falls onto an ant and protects it from the sun, and the Baal Shem Tov proves the point to his students. And I think that the Baal Shem Tov's opinion won, and that everybody from all camps, whether it's modern or Litvish or Sephardi or Hasidic, basically believe that nowadays. But the truth is, I think that people basically always believed this in a way, that God's involved with every single detail of creation and every molecule, every atom, every occurrence. We see it as a quite different opinion from the Rambam, who says that God's deistic, God's sort of removed from the world and only steps in at select times. This approach of the Baal Shem Tov, which may have always been the approach of Judaism, the folk approach, is that God's involved in every single detail of creation. And Rambam himself criticizes this approach, and now he didn't know the Baal Shem Tov, he was before the Baal Shem Tov, but he says that this is an approach of fools. So it's clear, at least in the Guide to the Perplexed, that Rambam does not believe that everything happens. So the problem with this opinion is that means even tragedy is from God, that everything is from God. I mean, and you can even say, according to the deistic opinion, that God set up the world and left it behind, that if you set up a computer program, and you can predict exactly what is going to be thousands of years down the line. Thousands of years down the line. You can predict what's going to be if you know every single factor in the equation. And certainly God, which is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, certainly does. But that aside, let's just get back to these two approaches. That the Rambam says that God is removed from the world, and therefore tragedy, as distinguished from evil, which is malicious, tragedy, diseases and suffering, that happens on its own as part of the world. And because of free will, God will not necessarily jump in unless a person is meritorious. Whereas the Baal Shem Tov says every single detail of creation, God is overlooking, and God's watching it, and everything has meaning, complete meaning. I want to bring down a few other sources in the Torah which may shed some light on both these opinions. We don't actually see the word evil written in the Torah until the sixth day of creation. And the first time we see the word evil appear is when God creates the Eitz Das Tov V'Ra, this tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We don't see it in any of the days up to that point. You never see the word evil. We don't see evil as a concept appear until the Eitz Das Tov V'Ra, which we know the trees were given to the people to eat, for Adam and Chava to eat, for Adam and Eve to eat. That is why the tree existed. And it's interesting, evil isn't by itself, but it says there that God created evil and good, the knowledge of it. And it seems there we can bring out is that it's perspective. It's our knowledge. Whether something is evil is how we look at it. The Baal Shem Tov has an interesting point about this in Savas Rivash. There he says, no evil falls from heaven. None. So what do you do with Isaiah and what do you do with Yirmiyahu? You have to say those are perspectives. It looks from us that evil falls from heaven. And we're going to look at that a little bit more at the end of this lecture. But it's not true. We don't see evil until by the Eitz Das Tov Ra, where a person's perspective, their knowledge, their das, can judge something as good or evil. And that's how we see things. But evil is not inherent in creation. The Arizal does say the word tahom, one of the first words in the second line of the Torah, the word tahom means the great depths, the infinite depths, the mystery, the dark mystery. He says that word can be rewritten to read hamavis, death. Death, which is evil, according to our perspective, is written into the Torah by the word tahom, the deep, the dark, the great mystery. The potential for evil is built into the creation by God. But evil doesn't exist until it comes to our perspective. To wrap up our two approaches here, we see that one approach, the Rambam and others, is that God is deistic. God allows evil to happen in the world, but it's from people. Tragedy happens in the world, but that's from just the way the world is built. There's a lot of problems, which we explored a few of them with this approach, obviously. But nevertheless, God isn't necessarily directly responsible for tragedy. God allows it to happen, unless a person is meritorious. Evil is malicious. If a person murders somebody, that's evil. Only people can do evil. As we said, the perspective of evil only is created on the Eitz Das Tov Ra, which is on the sixth day, which is created for people. That day is the day of creation of people. God himself did not build the creation to have evil in it, only the potential for people to bring evil into it. Right? Unless a person merits, God's not going to step in because, as I said there, that free will, the fact there's reward and punishment and people have the choice to choose good and push away bad, that has to be built into creation. What about our question? Why would God set apart 3 weeks of difficulty, of tragedy? That after the sin of the spies, God decreed that that day, Tisha B'Av, would be the day of tragedy of all time, and it existed that way. Sure, this is a hard question. I would like to tell you that I have the answer, but I don't. I think it goes back to my video, I don't know, which I'll post at the end of this video. I don't really know why God did such a thing, but if I could come up with an answer, which I think is weak, I would say the reason God created this time is for us to, one, be aware of the temple, be aware that we're missing something in the world, and also to be aware that there are consequences to our actions, reward and punishment to our actions, and that everything is watched over. There is such a concept of God's judgment in the world. What about our 2 verses? We have the verse in Isaiah. God creates light and creates darkness. He creates peace and he creates evil. Maimonides already dealt with this, and he says that the word bore means something from nothing. And that's also like the first line of the Torah where God created the world. And that's something from nothing. God created something from nothingness. So too, he says the word bore always indicates a lack of something. So evil is not a substance in itself. Evil is a lack of something. Maimonides talks about there in chapter 10 of the third part of Guide to the Perplexed. He says there that evil is a lack of something. It's a lack of light. It's a lack of good. Therefore, this verse here isn't saying that God created evil in something in itself. He's saying when there's a lack of light, there's a perspective there that we can have, and it seems like things are evil. So you have to touch up Isaiah here to say this is from perspective. Just like the Eitz Das Tov Ra, it's perspective, it's knowledge, it's from human level. The Rambam says the Torah is written in the language of people, and therefore we see things as evil. But no evil falls from heaven, according to the Baal Shem Tov. And I also believe there's a Midrash which says the same thing. And God is pure good. There's no such thing as evil. So Isaiah here says that. And we already see this. It's the first line that we say when we daven in the morning in Shachris, once we get to the main prayers of Shachris. We read Isaiah's line, but it says, Yotzer or Rechoshek, Ose Shalom Uvrei Asakol. He skips out that word there. The liturgy skips out that word there of God creates evil and changes it to God creates everything. Meaning it's everything. It's all part of the perspective of the oneness of creation. We can't understand as people why things are. And what about our Yirmiyahu? What do we do with Yirmiyahu? It says here in Yirmiyahu, Mi pi elyon lo setze haraos v'hatov. Is it not from the Most High? Is it not from God that both evil and good emanate? Meaning is God does evil. Well, that's what we're going to read tonight in Eicha. And we have to look at it in context. All Torah has to be understood in context. If you go back to verse 31, I'll just read it in English for time's sake. This is what it says. For the Lord does not reject forever. He first afflicts, then pities according to his abundant kindness. For he does not torment capriciously, nor afflict man, nor crush under his feet all the prisoners of the earth, nor deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High. To wrong a man in his conflict, the Lord does not approve. Whose decree was ever fulfilled unless the Lord ordained it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that evil and good emanate? Of what a living man complain, a strong man for his sins? Let us search and examine our ways and return to God. Let us lift our hearts with our hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled. You have not forgiven. You have enveloped yourself in anger and pursued us. You have slain mercilessly. Clearly here, he says here that the evil that's coming here is from our perspective because it was all just discipline. He who God loves, he disciplines, we know from Proverbs. And that all the bad that happened here really is the whole theme of Eicha, of Lamentations, is that the evil that he's saying emanates from God here is not talking about God creating evil for the sake of evil. It's talking about the discipline, the necessary reward and punishment that God builds into the world. And you can see that throughout the whole thing. It says God does not reject forever. God afflicts and then pities according to his kindness. He does not torment capriciously, nor afflict man, nor deny a man justice. Evil would be without justice, maliciousness. Everything, the evil, it says here in context, we clearly see from Yirmiyahu that it's the context of discipline and mida keneged mida, reward and punishment. What's really interesting here is that last verse there where it says, you have enveloped yourself in anger and pursued us. What seems like anger from God, what seems like evil, is not anger in itself. It's not evil. Rather, it's envelopment. God has to put on the garments of evil, of calamity on us in order that we should learn from our mistakes. It's not true anger or evil. God is not wrathful. God is doing it as a way to bring us to be closer to him and to learn. To wrap up, I want to bring another beautiful verse in Isaiah. Your ways are not our ways. Ultimately, we don't really know and understand why God does the things he does. We have the two approaches. One, that God lets tragedy happen or lets people do evil because he doesn't want to intervene people's free will. And then we see the Baal Shem Tov's approach, which it's more difficult to understand. If we say that every single detail is from God, then we must say even tragedies, things that look like they're acts of nature, really are also coming from God. And that's really the folk approach, the approach that most people hold by and really appeals to the person. And that, we really need this verse from Isaiah, which says, your ways are not our ways. We really don't know. We don't understand why God does the things that he does, but we do believe and hope and pray and have faith. We don't know why God does the things he does. Your ways are not our ways, but we do know it's for the good, it's for the best, and that's our tradition. If we didn't have the tradition, we wouldn't have Aleph and Beis. We wouldn't even have anywhere to start. The tradition has kept us alive for thousands of years through the worst calamities. We should get through this Tisha B'Av with no problems. Beis Hamikdash should come. We should have redemption and Geula for the whole world. We should have peace. All the good should come to the world. We should see everything as revealed good and understand that everything that happened was exactly the way it was supposed to be, according to God's will. There's a famous Gemara where Moshe goes up to Hashem, and he sees the suffering of Akiva. He says, this is Torah and its reward. God answers in that Gemara, Menachos, page 29. He says, Shtok, kach alam makshava. Be quiet. This is what I decided to do. Similarly, Moshe wants to know what is God's ways? What is the secret of tzaddik v'ravo? The secret of why does a good person suffer? And God says the same thing. He says, I will be what I will be. It's like Isaiah says, your ways are not our ways. God, we don't understand. Let us serve you and be close to you and not let our own mind, our own thinking try to figure everything out. And just accept you with humility and submission, light and love. Thank you very much. This is Rabbi Adam Law. My video on Tisha B'Av, is God bad? We must say, God is good. We don't always understand why God does the things he does. have a meaningful fast. Thank you.